The fire roared high, consuming the young priestess's flesh and bones. Her screams, once sharp and desperate, had faded into weak moans as the flames devoured her body bound to the stake. Helga Ravnsdottir watched from afar, her hands trembling uncontrollably as silent tears traced lines down her weathered face. "Forgive me, daughter," she whispered to the cold northern wind, knowing her words would never reach the ears of the child she had betrayed. "Thank you for being here and joining this journey into the harsh and unforgiving world of the Vikings. This channel is just beginning, and every single subscription means the world. It helps keep this project alive as we strive to reach our first 1,000 subscribers. If you appreciate the stories and the depth of these human dramas, please consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us what city you're watching from. I'd love to know where this tale is reaching." The dawn crept slowly over Ravnholm, its pale light seeping through the dense canopy of ancient pines that guarded the village like silent sentinels. The crisp air bore the faint scent of damp earth and burning peat from the communal hearths, mingling with the sharp tang of pine resin that clung stubbornly to the bark. Somewhere in the distance, a lone raven croaked, its voice deep and hollow, echoing through the stillness of the northern morning. Inside a modest cabin nestled at the edge of the settlement, the faint flicker of a fire cast trembling shadows against rough-hewn walls. Helga Ravnsdottir stirred beneath a heavy woolen blanket, her breath visible in the cold air that seeped through cracks in the wooden planks. At 53 winters, her body no longer moved with the youthful agility it once possessed, though her mind remained sharp and alert. Her bones, weathered like the stones of the nearby river, ached with the weight of years spent bending over herbs and cryptic runes. Her long, silver hair lay tangled across the fur-covered pallet, threaded with tiny bones and feathers, tokens of her craft and lineage. Each amulet held a story, a prayer whispered to the gods for protection and guidance. Her eyes, a piercing shade of gray like storm clouds gathering over the fjord, flickered open. The world outside was still shrouded in mist, the awakening sun just a ghostly glow beyond the treetops. Rising slowly, Helga moved with deliberate care toward the small wooden table cluttered with dried herbs, mortar, and pestle. The scent of mugwort, heather, and juniper filled the cramped space, mingling with the faint smoke rising from a small iron brazier where a handful of fragrant leaves burned steadily. She inhaled deeply, drawing strength from the familiar aromas, a ritual that steadied her nerves and connected her to the unseen world she so often communed with. Outside, frost clung stubbornly to the branches and blades of grass, shimmering like a delicate lacework in the pale morning light. The cold was biting, a constant reminder that the seasons in this remote corner of the world were harsh and unforgiving. Helga pulled a heavy woolen cloak tighter around her shoulders as she stepped outside, her breath misting in little clouds against the icy air. The village of Ravnholm lay nestled between the forest and the jagged shore of a fjord, a cluster of timber longhouses with thatched roofs darkened by smoke and age. Smoke spiraled upwards from the chimneys, promising warmth and the scent of morning fires. The ground was hard beneath her worn leather boots, the earth frozen solid after a cold night. As Helga crossed the clearing toward the edge of the woods, a subtle movement in the underbrush caught her eye. A small hare darted through the thorny brambles, its white winter coat almost blending into the lingering frost. The quiet of the forest was broken only by the crunch of her boots on the frozen soil and the distant call of birds awakening to the day. Helga's mind was already turning to the tasks ahead, gathering herbs, preparing cures, reading the signs the spirits might send. She carried a leather pouch filled with carefully collected roots, dried flowers, and powdered minerals, the tools of her trade as the clan's healer and seer. Her hands, though marked with the wrinkles and veins of age, were steady and sure as she sifted through the offerings, selecting a sprig of yarrow known for its protective properties. In the stillness, a sudden gust of wind stirred the branches above, tossing a scattering of brittle leaves across the frozen ground. Helga paused, her eyes narrowing as if trying to see beyond the veil of the physical world into the realm of the spirits. For decades, she had walked this line, both revered and feared for her gifts. Her role was vital to the clan's survival, offering guidance through dreams, portents, and remedies. Yet the weight of responsibility pressed down on her now more heavily than ever. Her thoughts drifted to Thyra, her daughter. The girl was unlike any child Helga had known, wild and fierce, with a fire in her eyes that refused to be dimmed by the village's harsh judgments. Thyra's visions had begun only 3 moons ago, whispers from the spirit realm that had grown louder, more urgent. Helga felt a protectiveness rising within her, mingled with a deep unease. The matriarch's routines were interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. It was early for visitors, and a shadow fell across the threshold. Helga's heart tightened. In stepped Thyra, her dark hair falling in untamed waves around her pale face, her blue eyes wide with a restless light. The girl's breath came in quick bursts, visible in the cold air like fleeting ghosts. "Mother," Thyra said, voice barely above a whisper but trembling with urgency. The voices came again last night. Helga motioned for her daughter to enter, closing the door against the chill. The small cabin felt suddenly full, the flickering firelight illuminating the sharp contrast between the 2 women. Helga's face, etched with years of hardship and wisdom, softened as she reached out to grasp Thyra's hands. "Tell me," she urged gently, though a knot tightened deep in her stomach. Thyra took a shaky breath, glancing toward the smoke curling from the hearth before she spoke. "The spirits warned me of a darkness coming, not just the cold of winter, but an endless night. The sun will hide behind the shadows, and the frost will never leave. Our people will perish if we do not prepare." Helga felt the weight of those words settle like a stone in her chest. She had heard many warnings in her lifetime, omens of war, famine, death, but this was unlike anything she had faced before. The endless night was a prophecy that chilled her soul more than any winter frost. "Have you spoken to anyone else?" Helga asked, her voice low, careful. "Only Leaf," Thyra replied, a faint flush coloring her cheeks. "He believes me. We spoke until dawn about what must be done." Helga's gaze drifted to the window, where the gray sky pressed close to the earth, and the first rays of sun struggled to break through the clouds. She clenched her jaw, wrestling with the storm raging inside her. The jarl, Gunnar Haraldsson, was a man hardened by loss and conflict. Since the death of his eldest son last winter, his heart seemed sealed against the old ways. He had little patience for visions and spirits he deemed superstition. Helga knew the dangers of crossing him. His authority was absolute, his judgment swift. Thyra's warnings could be seen as a threat to his fragile hold on power. "Your visions are powerful, Thyra," Helga said softly, "but you must be cautious. Gunnar will not tolerate talk of omens that unsettle the clan." Thyra's eyes blazed with defiance. "Our people need to know. If we ignore this, they will die unprepared." Helga reached out, her fingers brushing her daughter's cheek, warmth against the cold pallor of her skin. "I will protect you," she promised, though the words tasted bitter. "But we must be wise. Speak carefully." Outside, the village began to stir. The rhythmic clatter of wooden wheels on packed dirt, the low murmur of men preparing for the day's labor, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer punctuated the morning air. Life in Ravnholm was a constant struggle against the elements, the wild land, and the unseen forces that shaped their fate. Helga spent the morning gathering ingredients from the forest floor, bright red berries, sprigs of sage, roots heavy with earth's stubborn vitality. The task demanded focus, a connection to the natural world that had been honed through years of solitary work. Each plant held a meaning, a power that could heal wounds, yet beneath the outward calm, tension simmered. It was whispered that Gunnar's new wife, Astrid, wielded influence over the jarl unlike any before her. Young and striking, she bore the looks of a noble born, yet her eyes held a cold calculation that unsettled many. Her disdain for the old ways was no secret, and murmurs of discontent clung to the corners of every gathering. As Helga made her way toward the longhouse where the jarl held court, she sensed the weight of unseen eyes upon her. The threat to her daughter was no longer distant rumor. It was real, creeping closer like the coming storm. Inside the dim, smoke-filled hall, the air was thick with the scent of burning pine and the murmurs of assembled clansmen. Gunnar sat at the head of the hall, his broad frame draped in a bear pelt, the golden bracelet on his wrist catching the flickering light. His face was etched with lines of command and sorrow, his gaze sharp and unyielding. Astrid stood beside him, her posture regal, lips pressed in a thin line. When Helga's eyes met hers, a flicker of challenge passed between them. The new wife's smile was a blade sheathed just out of sight, beautiful but deadly. The council was called to address the growing unease sown by Thyra's visions. Whispers filled the hall, voices rising and falling like the tide, some fearful, others angry. The old ways clashed with the new, faith in the gods trembling under the weight of recent losses and the encroaching power of foreign faiths. Helga's heart pounded fiercely, each beat a drum of warning. She knew what was to come. The daughter she had sworn to protect would become the target of suspicion and scorn. And in that hall, surrounded by those who once trusted her, Helga would face the impossible choice between loyalty and survival. Outside, the wind howled like a grieving spirit, and the sky darkened beneath heavy clouds. The endless night was still a distant shadow, but its breath was already cold against the bones of Ravnholm. And in the flickering firelight, Helga Ravnsdottir prepared to confront the darkness, both without and within. The chill of the late afternoon settled over Ravnholm like a shroud, drawing long shadows across the village as the sun dipped lower behind the trees. Helga moved slowly through the narrow paths between the longhouses, her cloak wrapped tightly against the biting wind. Her thoughts churned relentlessly, memories of her daughter's fearful eyes, the harsh judgment of the jarl's hall, the weight of her own silence pressing down like an iron shackle. Every breath she took felt heavy, laden with the scent of smoke from distant hearths and the distant murmur of villagers returning from their labors. The village was quieter now, subdued beneath the weight of fear that had begun to settle like frost. Mothers hurried their children indoors, locking doors that had once stood open in trust. Men gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones of the girl who had been branded a witch, the visions that had brought doom upon them all. Helga's hands trembled beneath her cloak, the familiar runic tattoos on her wrists seeming to burn beneath the chill. As she rounded a corner near the smithy, a sudden, faint cry pierced the cold air. Helga froze, her heart tightening. The sound was fragile, a child's desperate call barely carried on the wind. Instinct propelled her forward, limbs moving with an urgency that belied her aching joints. She followed the plaintive sound, weaving through the shadows cast by the dying light. There, huddled against the rough bark of an ancient oak at the edge of the village clearing, was a small figure, a girl no older than 7, wrapped in threadbare rags stained with dirt and blood. Her knees were drawn close to her chest, her face hidden in the tangle of dark hair that fell over her trembling frame. The girl's hands clutched something tightly to her chest, a faded cloth bundle that seemed as fragile as her trembling body. Helga's breath caught in her throat. The child was pale beyond the pallor of youth, her lips cracked and blue from the cold. A deep bruise marred the side of her cheek, and her eyes, when she finally looked up, were wide with terror, shimmering as if reflecting an endless night all their own. For a moment, Helga hesitated. The jarl's edict had been clear. Suspicion and fear had poisoned the village, and any outsider, any weakling, or any bearer of ill fortune was a threat to their survival. Helping this child, whoever she was, could mean drawing dangerous attention. But the flicker of something familiar, maybe the same fire that had burned in Thyra's eyes, stirred within Helga's heart. "Child." Helga's voice was soft but steady, like the whisper of the wind through pine branches. "What is your name? Why are you here alone?" The girl flinched but did not speak. She only tightened her grip on the bundle, as if it were the last thread holding her to life. Helga took a slow step closer, kneeling down to bring herself to the child's level, careful not to startle her further. "It's cold. You must come inside," Helga said gently, lifting a hand to brush a stray lock of hair from the girl's face. "You are safe with me." Slowly, the child allowed herself to be pulled up, leaning on Helga's sturdy frame. The seer could feel the fragile weight of her trembling, hear the rapid beat of her small heart against her own side. Helga wrapped her cloak around the girl, shielding her from the encroaching cold like a shield forged in fire. As they moved back toward the village, Helga's mind raced with questions. Who had abandoned this child? Was she a victim of the jarl's purge, a casualty of the growing paranoia? Or perhaps she was a messenger, a living omen, another thread in the tangled web of fate unraveling around them all. Inside her cabin, the warmth of the fire was a sharp contrast to the biting night outside. Helga set the girl down on a fur-covered bench, fetching a bowl of warm broth and a strip of coarse bread. The child accepted the food hesitantly, eyes darting around the unfamiliar surroundings. Helga's gaze softened as she watched her eat, memories of Thyra's youth flooding her mind, her curiosity, her fierce spirit, the light that had once shone so brightly before darkness threatened to snuff it out. But this child was different. There was a shadow in her that Helga could not yet name. The bundle she carried still pressed tightly to her chest, and the girl's small hands trembled as she stroked its worn fabric. Helga waited, patient, sensing that trust would come slowly. Hours passed, the fire crackling low in the hearth. Outside, the wind howled like a mourning spirit, rattling the wooden walls of the cabin. The child's breathing grew steady, and her eyes, once filled with terror, began to settle. Finally, she whispered a name broken by cold and fear. Thyra. Helga's heart clenched. The name was rare in these parts, a name that spoke of mercy and protection. She reached out, placing her hand gently over Thyra's, grounding the child in the present, in the fragile safety of this moment. "My dear Thyra," Helga murmured, "how did you come to be alone in the woods? Who left you to the cold?" The girl's eyes filled with tears, glistening like frozen dew in the firelight. "The men came in the night. They took my family, said we were cursed. They said the gods had forsaken us, but I did not do wrong." Helga swallowed hard, the bitter taste of betrayal rising. She had heard whispers of raids, of families torn apart under suspicion, fear breeding cruelty. The jarl's court had grown ruthless, blinded by grief and anger. The same fear that had condemned her daughter to the fire now threatened this child's life. Her hands clenched into fists, knuckles white beneath the worn leather gloves. The choice before her was stark and terrifying. Turn away and preserve what little safety remained for herself, or risk everything to protect this fragile soul. The night deepened, and with it, Helga's resolve hardened. The cold that pressed at the village was no longer just a season. It was a darkness that devoured hope itself. To survive, they would need more than strength. They would need courage born of compassion. She drew Thyra close, wrapping her arms around the trembling child. "You will stay with me," Helga said with quiet determination. "I will keep you safe from those who fear what they do not understand." A fragile hope flickered in Thyra's eyes, and for the first time since the fire had claimed Thyra, Helga felt a faint warmth stir within her, a call to fight against the night, to honor the daughter she had lost by protecting the innocent left behind. Outside, the cold wind clawed at the windows, But within the small cabin, a fire burned steady, an ember of for a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the slow rhythm of the hearth's flames, casting flickering shadows that danced across rough-hewn wooden beams, and the tapestry of herbs hung carefully from the rafters. Thyra's wide eyes, rimmed with exhaustion and fear, met Helga's, a silent conversation unfolding between two souls marked by loss and the cold grip of uncertainty. Helga knelt to meet Thyra's gaze more fully, reaching out to brush a stray lock of tangled dark hair from the child's pale forehead. The touch was gentle, deliberate, a mother's gesture born of instinct rather than familiarity. Thyra flinched slightly, but did not pull away. Instead, her fingers curled weakly around the hem of the cloak as though anchoring herself to the fragile thread of safety it represented. Slowly, Helga moved to a low wooden stool near the hearth, pulling it close so Thyra could sit and draw warmth from the roaring fire. She fetched a rough clay bowl from the shelf, pouring thick, steaming broth into it. The smell was earthy and rich, made from roots and meat, flavored with wild herbs Helga harvested herself. She offered the bowl with a quiet invitation. Thyra accepted it hesitantly, her thin fingers trembling as she clasped the bowl's rim. The warmth seeped into her cold hands, and she brought the broth to her lips, sipping carefully at first, then with growing courage. The simple act of nourishment seemed to revive some flicker of life within her, softening the rigid fear that clung to her like a second skin. Helga watched, heart aching, as the child's expression shifted. The tight lines of suffering relaxed, replaced by a fragile gratitude. The faintest tremor of a smile ghosted across Thyra's lips, barely noticeable but powerful in its quiet defiance against despair. As Thyra ate, Helga's eyes wandered to the bundle the girl still clutched close, wrapped in a faded, threadbare cloth, worn from years of handling. With cautious curiosity, Helga reached out, her fingers brushing the bundle's edge. Thyra's grip tightened instantly, but instead of pulling back, she looked up at Helga with pleading eyes filled with unspoken stories. The seer's gaze lingered on the bundle, noting the faint embroidery, the delicate stitching of an unfamiliar weave, dark blue threads forming a pattern that seemed more ancient than the village itself. The fabric smelled faintly of smoke and pine sap, carrying a scent that tugged at Helga's memories like a ghost from a distant past. "May I?" Helga asked softly, nodding toward the bundle. Thyra hesitated, struggling between trust and fear. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she unwrapped the cloth just enough to reveal a small carved wooden figure, worn smooth from years of handling, but still holding the intricate form of a woman with arms raised to the sky, her eyes closed in prayer or sorrow. Helga's breath caught. The figure was unmistakable, a representation of Freya, the goddess of love, fertility, and war, revered by the old ways that many in Ravenholm still held sacred, even as fear threatened to snuff their traditions. The delicate carving was both beautiful and haunting, a talisman of protection and hope. Thyra's voice broke the silence, soft and hesitant, speaking in a dialect that was foreign yet tinged with familiar Old Norse roots. "More Freya protects me," she whispered, clutching the figure to her chest. Helga nodded slowly, understanding more than the words themselves. This child was not just a survivor of violence and fear, but a bearer of old faith, a fragile thread connecting the past and present in a world tilting toward darkness. Carefully, Helga reached into her own pouch, pulling out a small bundle of dried herbs, lavender, mugwort, and a fragment of rowan bark. She crushed them gently in her palm, the fragrant aroma mingling with the fire smoke. With practiced hands, she prepared a poultice, warm and soothing, and lifted Thyra's trembling chin to examine the bruise that marred her cheek. The child winced as the ointment was applied, but did not pull away. Helga's touch was steady and sure, trained by decades of healing bodies and calming restless spirits. As she worked, she murmured a quiet blessing to the old gods, seeking their protection for this fragile life. Thyra's eyes drifted closed for a moment, the tension in her small frame easing with each breath. When she opened them again, they held a new softness, a fragile trust beginning to take root. Helga moved to the corner of the cabin where a small bed was fashioned from thick furs and blankets. She guided Thyra toward it gently, helping the child to lie down beneath the warmth. As she tucked the cloak around Thyra's shivering form, Helga's own heart tightened with a bittersweet ache. This child was a reminder of all that had been lost, and all that still hung precariously in the balance. The silence between them grew comfortable, filled not with words, but with the language of shared suffering and tentative hope. Helga sat beside the bed, fingers tracing the patterns of the runes tattooed faintly on her own wrists, while Thyra's breathing slowed, the steady rhythm of fragile promise against the encroaching darkness. Minutes passed. Outside, the wind rattled the cabin's weathered walls. But inside, the fire's glow softened the shadows, weaving a fragile cocoon of warmth and protection. Then, without breaking the quiet, Thyra shifted slightly, reaching a small hand toward Helga's. The old woman hesitated, then intertwined their fingers, a simple gesture, yet profound. In that moment, the distance between mother and child, healer and ward, seemed to collapse. Helga's eyes misted as she squeezed gently, feeling the tremor of life beneath her touch. A fragile promise that even in the harshest winter, there could be light. "You are safe here," Helga whispered, voice cracking with emotion she could not hide. "I will protect you, little one." Thyra's breath caught, a faint nod the only reply. Her gaze locked on Helga's, shimmering with an unspoken question, the hope that this stranger, with the silver hair and knowing eyes, could be a guardian in a world grown cruel. As night deepened beyond the sturdy walls, Helga let the silence settle around them, a fragile bond forming in the quiet space between firelight and shadow. Memories of Thyra stirred like ghosts in Helga's mind, the fierce spirit, the untamed fire that had burned too brightly. Now, in this fragile child curled beneath the furs, there was a chance to mend something broken, to fight against the endless night that threatened to consume them all. Outside, the first snowflakes began to drift down, silent and relentless, dusting the world in cold white. Inside, a fire burned steady, a beacon against the dark. The fragile calm that had settled over Helga's cabin was shattered not by the wind or the cold, but by the growing unrest beyond its walls. Word, like a restless shadow, crept through Ravenholm's frozen streets and into the dense woods that hemmed the village. The rescue of the girl, Thyra, was no secret for long. Whispers stirred like dry leaves in a rising gust, twisting through the longhouses and spilling into the ears of those who once revered Helga's wisdom, and those who now viewed her with suspicion. Helga felt it before she heard it. The low murmur of voices carried on the stiff northern breeze, the hurried footsteps crunching over frost-hardened earth. Her heart tightened when a rough knock echoed against the timber door, sharp and demanding. She knew who it was before she even looked. The village was watching. The separation between sanctuary and scrutiny had narrowed to a thin line. When the door creaked open, 2 men filled the threshold, grizzled warriors clad in worn furs, their eyes cold and unyielding beneath furrowed brows. One bore the unmistakable mark of Gunnar's guard, the heavy gold bracelet glinting faintly, a symbol not just of protection, but of authority. The other, younger but no less stern, carried a spear tipped with iron, its gleam stark against the gray light of the early afternoon. "Helga Ravnsdottir," the elder man said, his voice a gravelly echo of the harsh landscape. "The jarl requests your presence. There are questions about your recent actions." Helga's shrunken shoulders straightened, the weight of years folding into a brittle resolve. "I tend to those in need," she replied softly, her voice barely above the crack outside. The village was a different world from the sanctuary Helga had known. The pale sun struggled to pierce a shroud of low-hanging clouds, casting the long houses and narrow streets in a muted, lifeless light. Frost-coated rooftops gleamed dully as villagers hurried about their tasks, their faces drawn with anxiety and whispered fears. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, eyes wide with the stories that had begun to weave through the air, of curses, of omens, of a darkness spreading beyond the forest's edge. As Helga was escorted toward the longhouse, the murmurs rose, growing louder, more accusatory. Men and women alike cast sidelong glances her way, suspicion thick as smoke. Some whispered of her daughter Thyra, of the fire that had consumed her and the prophecy that had followed. Others spoke in hushed tones of the new wife, Astrid, whose influence over the jarl seemed to tighten like a noose around the village's throat. The longhouse loomed ahead, massive and foreboding, its timbers blackened by years of fire and smoke. The heavy door groaned as it was pushed open, revealing a hall dimly lit by sconces bearing flickering tallow candles. The air inside was thick with the scent of burnt pine, sweat, and old blood, the remnants of countless councils and conflicts. At the far end, seated on a carved wooden throne draped with bear pelts, sat Jarl Gunnar Haraldsson. His gaze was a blade honed sharp by grief and suspicion, eyes narrowing as Helga approached. Astrid stood beside him, her posture impeccable, her icy blue eyes calculating beneath a veneer of calm. "The clan is fragile," Gunnar began, his voice low but heavy with command. "Fear threatens to unravel us, and those who fan its flames must be called to account." Helga met his gaze, the memory of Thyra's pleas echoing in her mind like a mournful song. "I saved a child from the cold," she said simply. "Is that a crime?" Astrid stepped forward, her smile thin and lethal. "That child is an unknown, a potential curse. To harbor such a one is to invite ruin. You would risk the clan's safety on sentimental folly." A ripple of murmurs rose from the gathered clan elders and warriors. Some nodded grimly, others exchanged uneasy looks. The fear that had simmered beneath the surface now boiled openly. Helga's voice grew firmer, though the ache in her chest threatened to break through. "Is it fear that guides your judgment, Jarl, or vengeance for the past?" Gunnar's jaw tightened, the scars on his face seeming to darken beneath the flickering light. "The past is written in blood. I will not allow that history to repeat." The tension in the hall was palpable, the weight of unspoken threats pressing down like the winter sky. Helga knew this was no longer about mercy or justice. It was a test of wills, where the fate of a frightened child hung precariously between survival and death. Outside, the first distant howls of wolves echoed from the forest, a chilling reminder of the wild world pressing against the fragile order of Ravnholm. The villagers, sensing the shifting winds of power, gathered at the edges of the square, their faces masks of fear and resolve. The council demanded answers. What was Ira's origin? Was she truly a cursed soul? Or was she a victim of their own spiraling paranoia? Helga's silence was both shield and sword. Revealing too much could invite destruction. Revealing too little would seal the child's fate. As the hours dragged on, rumors from neighboring tribes began to seep through the village like a creeping frost. News of refugees fleeing Christian raids to the south, of rival clans probing for weakness, of scouts glimpsing unnatural storms gathering on the horizon. The endless winter, once dismissed as a madwoman's tale, now whispered its cold truth in every cracked voice. Leaf, battered but resolute, stood among the crowd outside the longhouse, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His eyes found Helga's when the doors opened briefly, a silent plea passing between them. He had risked everything for Thyra once. Now, for Ira, his courage burned undiminished. Inside, the jarl's gaze flicked between the fragile girl bundled in furs and the woman who had dared defy his decree. The choice was clear, yet fraught with peril: to protect the vulnerable at the risk of fracturing the clan's fragile unity, or to bow to fear and sacrifice the innocent to save themselves. Helga's heart thundered in her chest. The ghosts of her past haunted every breath. She had denied Thyra's truth once, and now she faced the same crossroads. Could she summon the strength to stand against the tide of suspicion, to shield Thyra from the relentless cold, both outside and within the hearts of men? As the council's voice rose in condemnation, one word slicing through the chill like a blade: exile. Helga's resolve crystallized. The darkness was advancing, the endless night creeping ever closer. But within the fragile warmth of this small room, a flicker of defiance burned. It was not yet too late to fight for what remained of hope. Outside the longhouse, the village held its breath, the weight of history pressing down like snow upon the land. And within, Helga Ravnsdottir prepared to face not only the judgment of men, but the harsh reckoning of a world slipping into shadow. The dawn was a pale and reluctant witness to the turmoil that had settled over Ravnholm. The village, wrapped in a shroud of frost and uncertainty, seemed to hold its breath beneath a sky heavy with leaden clouds. The cold bit deep, sharper than any blade, as Helga Ravnsdottir prepared herself for what was to come. The small cabin that had offered refuge to Thyra felt suddenly fragile, vulnerable. The warmth of the fire flickered against the encroaching shadows, as if it alone stood between salvation and ruin. Outside, the village stirred with a restless unease. Low murmurs wove through the narrow streets. Whispers thickened with fear and suspicion. The news of Helga's defiance had traveled swiftly, carried on the winds like a warning. The jarl's men were gathering, their heavy boots pounding against frozen earth, their breath steaming in the cold air. The old seer could hear the distant clatter of weapons and the harsh bark of commands. Helga stood by the hearth, her fingers brushing against the worn amulet hanging at her neck, a symbol of Hel, the goddess of the underworld, once a source of comfort, now a burden. She glanced toward the small figure curled beneath the heavy furs near the fire. Thyra's sleep was restless, shadows flickering across her pale face. The child's fragile breathing was a stark reminder of all that was at stake. There was no time for doubt, no room for hesitation. The clan's fear was a wildfire, and Helga was both the spark and the flame. She drew a deep breath, steadying herself against the cold gnawing at her bones. The door shuddered under a heavy knock, firm and unyielding. Two guards stood silhouetted against the gray morning light, their visages grim and resolute. The elder, marked by the golden bracelet of the jarl's guard, spoke with the cold authority that had become all too familiar. "Helga Ravnsdottir, you are commanded to come before the jarl's court. Your actions threaten the clan's unity." Helga's eyes met theirs, steady despite the tremor that whispered beneath her skin. "I tend to those in need," she replied with quiet strength. "Always." The guards exchanged a glance before gesturing sharply. Helga wrapped her cloak tightly around her shoulders and stepped out into the biting air, the wooden door closing behind her with a final, ominous thud. The village square was already bristling with tension. Men and women gathered, their breath clouding the cold air, faces drawn taut with worry and suspicion. Children clung to their mothers, wide-eyed and silent. The ghosts of Thyra's fate hung heavy, a specter that lent every whisper a sharp edge. The longhouse loomed ahead, its dark timbers stark against the dull sky, an ancient fortress standing resolute in the face of an uncertain future. Helga's steps echoed on the frost-hardened ground as she approached, each stride a silent prayer. The weight of the village's gaze pressed against her like a physical force, the collective fear of a people teetering on the precipice. Inside, the hall was filled with the scent of burning pine and the low murmur of voices. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows that danced across the ancient runes carved into the wooden beams. At the far end, the jarl sat upon his. Helga's eyes searched the faces before her, some hardened with distrust, others clouded by uncertainty. She knew the truth. The jarl's grief had become a cage, locking the clan in a cycle of paranoia and cruelty. Thyra's death was a wound that festered, its pain redirected toward the innocent. With a resolve born of desperation, Helga stepped forward, raising her voice above the rising tension. "The winter you fear is real," she declared, eyes blazing. "My daughter's visions were true. The endless night is coming, and denial will not save us." Gunnar's gaze hardened, his voice a low growl. "Prophecies hold no place in this hall, Helga. Your daughter's fate is a warning. Do not tempt the gods with rebellion." The hall grew silent, the weight of his words settling like stone. Helga felt the eyes of the clan upon her, measuring, judging. The moment was a crucible, her truth against their fear, her love against their hatred. Suddenly, a sharp crack of the longhouse door echoed through the hall. Leif Thorvaldsen stepped forward, his face bruised but fierce with determination. "Hear me," he called out, voice raw. Thyra was not a liar. The spirits spoke, and we ignored them at our peril. His presence stirred the crowd, whispers rising like a storm. Some faces softened, others tightened with resentment. The jarl's eyes flickered to Leif, a silent warning in their depths. Helga seized the moment. "This child, Thyra, is not a threat," she said, gesturing toward the small figure at the edge of the hall. "She is a symbol of what remains. If we turn our backs now, we doom ourselves to the darkness my daughter foresaw." Astrid's laugh was cold and bitter. "Words are wind. You offer no proof, only superstition and sentiment." Gunnar rose, the golden bracelet on his wrist gleaming sharply. "Enough. The clan cannot survive division. Helga, you will be stripped of your title and exiled. The child will be taken and judged by the gods." The words landed like a hammer. Helga's breath caught, the world narrowing to the thunderous beat of her heart. She glanced at Thyra, whose wide eyes brimmed with silent terror. "No," Helga whispered, stepping between them and the child. "I will not abandon her. If you seek to divide us, to silence the old ways, you will find only ruin." The jarl's gaze was unforgiving. "So be it." His voice carried the weight of finality. "Guards, take her." Men moved forward, weapons raised not in welcome, but in judgment. Helga's mind raced. There was no room for bargaining now, only survival. Leif stepped beside her, fists clenched. "We stand with you." The hall erupted in shouts, a clash of fear and defiance. Helga's eyes met Thyra's once more, a silent vow passing between them. As the guards closed in, the seer summoned the last reserves of her strength. The endless night was upon them, and with it, the darkness of man's heart laid bare. In that moment, beneath the ancient timbers, the fragile threads of hope and despair wove together in a battle for their very souls. Outside, the wind howled through the village, carrying with it the cries of a people on the brink, caught between the cold grip of winter and the icy shadow of their own fear. Helga's voice rose above the chaos, a beacon in the gathering storm. "The spirits speak truth. We cannot silence them forever." And as the longhouse doors slammed shut behind her, the echoes of a shattered clan reverberated into the endless night. The days that followed were a blur of cold and shadow. Helga and Leif were cast out beyond the village bounds, their names sullied by accusation and fear. The bitter bite of exile was a punishment harsher than any blade. Yet, even in the wilderness, Helga's resolve did not waver. She tended to Thyra beneath the shelter of ancient pines, weaving protective charms and whispering prayers to the gods who seemed distant and silent. The girl's fragile strength grew, a testament to the resilience born of suffering. Helga carried with her the weight of her daughter's memory, the fiery spirit that had burned too bright, extinguished by the very people who should have cherished her. Each night, beneath the cold stars, Helga would close her eyes and see Thyra's face, eyes wide with fear and truth, voice broken by betrayal. The endless night that had been foretold was no longer a distant dream, but a living, breathing nightmare encroaching upon their world. The village of Ravenholm, isolated and unprepared, began to falter under the relentless winter's grasp. Food stores dwindled, the cold seeped into bones and hearts alike. One by one, the strong fell, warriors, mothers, children, claimed by the unforgiving frost. Helga bore witness to their suffering from afar, the ache of guilt a constant companion. She had denied her daughter's visions, silenced the only voice that might have saved them all. Now, she was condemned to carry that burden alone, a living testament to the cost of fear and betrayal. Yet, in the darkest hours, she found a flicker of hope. In Thyra's eyes, in the whispered prayers to forgotten gods, in the unyielding will to survive. The old ways were not dead. They were waiting, buried beneath the snow and shadow, ready to rise again. Helga's journey was far from over. The endless night had come, but so had the chance for redemption. In the heart of winter's cruel embrace, the seeds of a new dawn were sown, born of sacrifice, sorrow, and the unbreakable bonds of love. And as the cold wind swept across the frozen land, carrying the silent promise of change, Helga Ravnsdottir stood tall, not as a broken woman, but as the keeper of a truth too long denied. The bleak expanse of winter had settled so deeply over Ravenholm that even the sun's reluctant light seemed swallowed by the frozen horizon. Days blurred into nights beneath a sky smothered by heavy clouds, the relentless cold etching its silent message into the bones of the land and the hearts of those left to endure. The village, once alive with the clamor of daily life, now stood as a fragile husk, a place where whispers of hope struggled to breathe beneath the crushing weight of despair. Helga Ravnsdottir, once the revered seer of the clan, now walked a path carved by loss and bitter regret. The cloak of exile draped heavily over her shoulders, but the greater burden pressed within, the memory of her daughter, Thyra, whose fiery spirit had been extinguished by the very hands sworn to protect her. The sting of betrayal was a wound that festered beneath the frost's harsh grip, its ache threading through every moment like an endless shadow. Yet, amid the desolation, a faint light flickered, a fragile ember of redemption and renewal. The small cabin at the forest's edge, where Helga had taken refuge with the girl named Thyra, had become a sanctuary against the relentless night. Here, beneath the sheltering pines, life stubbornly clung to existence. The fire crackled low, casting wavering warmth against the rough-hewn walls, fighting back the cold that sought to seep through every crack. Thyra, once a trembling shadow of fear and fragility, had begun to reclaim a semblance of strength. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a faint memory, and the light in her eyes, though cautious, returned with a fragile resilience. Each day, Helga witnessed the slow rekindling of spirit, a testament to the power of compassion even in the darkest times. On this morning, the air was still, heavy with the scent of pine and smoke. Helga sat near the fire, hands folded in her lap, her gaze distant as it traced the curling wisps of flame. The weight of the endless winter pressed upon her soul, but beneath it, a new resolve had begun to forge itself, a determination born not from power or pride, but from love's unyielding grip. Thyra stirred from her rest, blinking against the faint light that filtered through the cabin's small window. Her pale fingers reached instinctively toward the wooden carving of Freya, the goddess who had become her talisman, a fragile link to the old faith that still pulsed quietly beneath the surface of their shattered world. Helga saw the gesture and smiled softly, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke. "Freya watches over you, child. as she once watched over my daughter. The girl's eyes met hers, a flicker of gratitude mingled with lingering fear. I am not Thyra, Ira said quietly, but I carry her hope. Helga opened the door, her heart quickening with a mixture of hope and dread. The firelight flickered across their faces, worn and weathered by hardship, but marked by a new resolve. Leaf stepped forward, his voice steady though edged with emotion. Helga, we were wrong. He paused, the raw honesty in his words hanging in the cold air like a fragile thread. Fear blinded us. Thyra's visions were true, and your mercy saved a life that might have been lost to cruelty. The old seer's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. It is not enough to admit the truth after the flames have claimed the innocent, she murmured, voice thick with sorrow. But it is a beginning. One of the elder women, her face lined like the bark of ancient trees, nodded slowly. We are tired of living in fear, she said quietly. The jarl's strength was once our shield, but now it has become a chain. We seek a new path. The visitor's presence was no mere petition. It was a plea for redemption and reconciliation. The walls of silence and suspicion that had isolated Helga began to crumble under the shared weight of grief and the desperate need for unity. Helga gestured toward the hearth, inviting them inside. The cabin, though small and humble, seemed to swell with the breath of possibility. The fire's warmth seeped into their chilled bones, thawing more than just the cold of winter. As the group settled, Ira emerged from her corner, her gaze bright and curious. She stepped forward tentatively, her small hand reaching toward Leaf's. The gesture was met with a gentle squeeze, a silent vow that whatever shadows had fallen before, they would now stand together. Leaf's eyes turned to Helga, filled with a fierce determination that rekindled something long dormant within her. We will rebuild, he pledged, not as scattered souls fearful of the night, but as one. The words echoed through the cabin like a solemn promise. The endless winter outside still raged, a merciless force indifferent to human suffering. But within these walls, a fragile peace had begun to take root. In the days that followed, the villagers who had dared to defy the jarl's cruel decrees joined Helga and Leaf in their hidden refuge. Together, they shared stories, tending wounds both physical and spiritual. They gathered what provisions they could, prepared shelters against the cold, and reawakened the old rites long suppressed by fear. Helga taught them the ancient songs and prayers, the sacred runes that spoke of cycles and renewal. Her voice, once a whisper drowned by doubt, grew strong again, a beacon for those lost in the darkness. Ira, no longer just a frightened child, blossomed under the care and protection of this new community. She carried the legacy of her predecessor, the hope that even in the longest night, the dawn would come. One evening, as the pale moonlight filtered through the frost-covered branches, Helga stood outside the cabin, her gaze lifted toward the starless sky. The cold bit at her skin, but within her chest, a warmth bloomed, an ember of faith not in the gods or the prophecies alone, but in the resilience of the human spirit. She whispered a prayer to Hel, the goddess who ruled over the shadows and the dead, and to Freya, the goddess of both love and war. Guide us through the darkness, Helga implored. Let the fire of truth and love burn bright in the endless night. Behind her, the soft murmur of voices rose from within the cabin. Voices joined in song, a tapestry of hope woven through the cold silence. The clan they had lost might never return, but from its ashes, a new beginning stirred. Helga knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with peril. The endless night was not merely a season. It was a reckoning, a test of faith and endurance. But she also knew that surrender was not an option. For Thyra, for Ira, for all who had suffered beneath the weight of fear and betrayal. Helga Ravnsdottir would carry their stories forward, a guardian of the old truths in a world that threatened to forget. And in the deepest dark, a single flame burned on. The first signs of thaw were subtle, a faint softening of the frozen ground beneath the thick blanket of snow, a timid whisper of wind carrying not just cold but a hint of promise. Ravenholm, battered by the longest and cruelest winter any living soul could recall, stood at the edge of a new beginning. The village was no longer the vibrant cluster it had once been, nor the fractured place of fear and suspicion it had sunk into during the dark days. Instead, it had become something different, something forged in the crucible of loss and tempered by the quiet strength of those who remained. Helga Ravnsdottir, once shrouded in exile and despair, now moved with a calm and measured purpose among the scattered survivors who had gathered near the edge of the forest. Her silver hair, still interwoven with the bones and feathers of her craft, caught the weak sunlight filtering through the pale clouds. Her eyes, those steely gray orbs that had witnessed so much suffering and sorrow, now held a steady fire, not of defiance, but of resolute hope. The cabin that had sheltered her and the child named Thyra had become a focal point for the few remaining villagers. It was modest and rough-hewn, its walls thick with smoke-stained logs and the lingering scent of herbs and pine resin. Around its hearth, stories were shared, wounds tended, and plans whispered. The old rituals, once scorned and feared, were carefully revived, not as mere superstition, but as threads weaving the fragile fabric of a renewed community. Thyra herself had grown stronger. The fragile, trembling child who had been carried into Helga's cabin like a breath of winter itself was now a young woman with a quiet dignity. Her dark hair, still threaded with the simple wooden carving of Freya, framed a face marked by both innocence and a burgeoning strength. The fear in her eyes had softened, replaced with a cautious trust that had woven itself between her and the woman who had become both guardian and guide. One afternoon, as Helga and Thyra worked together to prepare bundles of dried herbs, the sounds of approaching footsteps stirred the air. The sharp crunch of boots on frozen earth grew louder, and a figure stepped into the clearing bathed in the pale light. It was Leif Thorvaldsson, the young blacksmith whose love for Thyra had brought him so close to tragedy and whose loyalty had never wavered through the darkest storms. Leif's breath came in steady clouds that mingled with the faint smoke drifting from the cabin's chimney. His face, still bearing the marks of old bruises and lines carved by hardship, held a newfound softness as his eyes met Thyra's. For a moment, the three stood in silent recognition, survivors bound by pain and the fragile hope of healing. Leif, Helga greeted, her voice steady but warm. "You have traveled far." He nodded, a small smile breaking through the weariness. "I bring news and a hand to help. The others are gathering, ready to rebuild, if you will lead them." The weight of that simple plea settled on Helga's shoulders. The mantle of leadership was heavy, far heavier than the cloak she wore against the cold. But beneath the burden lay the fierce determination that had carried her through the endless night. Together, they stepped forward into the clearing where a handful of villagers had begun to clear snow and prepare the ground for new shelters. The work was slow but purposeful, each movement a defiant act against the long shadow winter had cast. Children, few but resilient, played cautiously nearby, their laughter fragile but real, the first bright notes breaking through a long silence. Helga spoke softly, her voice carrying a steadiness that reached the ears of all who gathered. "The old ways teach us that life comes in cycles, death and renewal. We have seen the darkness, and now we must tend the flame. We will honor those lost by building what remains with care and courage." Among the villagers was an elder woman whose lined face held the wisdom of many winters. She stepped forward, nodding in agreement. "We were blinded by fear," she said, voice thick with emotion. "But the gods have not abandoned us. It is time to remember who we are." The days that followed were marked by quiet, steady work. The survivors shared food and stories, their hearts slowly stitching together the fabric of their shattered community. Old songs were sung again, not as echoes of a forgotten past, but as living threads connecting each soul to the land and to one another. Helga found herself teaching again. Helga reached into her pouch and pulled out the small wooden carving of Freya, the goddess of love, fertility, and war. She held it gently in her hands, feeling the smooth grain beneath her fingertips. Freya watches over us still, she murmured, more to herself than to Thyra. Her strength is in the turning of the seasons, the promise that even the darkest night must end. Thyra looked up, eyes reflecting the pale light. Will the sun return, Helga? Will the endless winter finally break? Helga's lips curved in a faint, weary smile. It must. The world turns, and life finds a way. But it is our hearts, our courage, that bring the dawn. They sat together in silence, two souls linked across the years, mother and daughter, past and future, bound by love and loss. The next morning, a figure appeared at the edge of the village, a man wrapped in furs, his face weathered but hopeful. It was a traveler, a messenger from beyond the mountains, bearing news of distant clans also enduring the long winter's grip, yet holding fast to traditions and the old gods. Helga welcomed him, seeing in his eyes the same flame that had refused to be extinguished in her own heart. The outside world was changing, shaped by forces beyond their control. Yet amidst the uncertainty, the seeds of a new beginning were taking root. As the sun rose higher, casting golden light over the snow-dusted rooftops, Helga stood among her people. The scars of the past winter remained, but so did the unbreakable bonds forged in fire and shadow. She raised her voice, steady and clear. We carry the stories of those who came before us, not as chains, but as guides. The gods watch, and so do we. Together, we will face the turning of the world. Around her, the villagers nodded, their faces lifted toward the light. The wind stirred, carrying with it the faint, hopeful song of a new day. Helga felt the weight of her years and losses settle into quiet strength. The endless night had tested them all, but from its depths, a new dawn was born, not in warmth alone, but in the courage to hope, to forgive, and to rebuild. And as the frost began to melt and the first green shoots peeked through the snow, Helga Ravsdottir knew that her daughter's spirit lived on, in every whispered prayer, every healed wound, every shared story beneath the vast, unyielding sky of the north. The cycle continued. The night would end, the morning would come, and with it, the promise of life renewed beyond the endless winter. The cold wind carried a biting edge, swirling the flakes of snow into restless dances across the frozen earth. Helga stood at the edge of the clearing, her gaze tracing the pale horizon where the sun barely warmed the gray sky. The silence around her was profound, broken only by the faint crackling of the fire within the cabin and the distant mournful howl of wolves, reminders of a world both ancient and unforgiving. She clutched the worn wooden carving of Freya in her hands, feeling the smooth grain beneath her fingertips, a tether to a past that had slipped through her grasp like drifting ash. The long winter was finally loosening its grip, though the scars it left ran deep. Ravenholm was no longer the village it once was, a place of laughter and clamor now reduced to quiet resilience. The people who remained bore the weight of loss heavy in their eyes, their bodies weathered by frost and hunger, yet their spirits had not broken. Around her, the faint glow of hearth fires flickered, homes rebuilt from the ruin of frost-bitten timbers and shattered trust. Helga's mind wandered through the harrowing months that had passed, the fire that consumed Thyra, the daughter whose fierce voice had been silenced by fear and betrayal. The memory of her daughter's bright eyes, alive with truth and defiance, haunted every moment. Helga had denied those visions once, hoping to shield her daughter from the cruelty of men. But silence had been a blade sharper than any sword. The endless night had come, just as Thyra had foreseen, and Helga lived with the unbearable weight of her own failing. Yet, amid the sorrow, there was a fragile flame that refused to be extinguished. Thyra, the child rescued from the cold and suspicion, had become a living symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, life finds a way to persist. The girl's quiet strength, her cautious trust, were a balm to Helga's fractured heart. Together, they had forged a small sanctuary where the old ways stirred once more beneath the snow, where prayers whispered to gods long forgotten mingled with the breath of those still willing to listen. The villagers, once divided by fear and suspicion, were slowly knitting themselves back together. Forgiveness was tentative, like the first fragile shoots that pushed through frozen soil, but it was there. The old songs rose again from trembling lips. The sacred runes glowed faintly in the firelight, their ancient meanings sewing threads of resilience and renewal. Helga felt the weight of responsibility anew, not just as a seer or healer, but as a guardian of memory and truth. The stories of Thyra and Iroh were entwined, lessons carved into the fragile fabric of their lives. Fear could destroy, but love could endure beyond fire and frost. One evening, as the cold deepened and shadows lengthened, Helga sat outside the cabin, the night sky a tapestry of dark velvet. Thyra rested beside her, her breath steady, her eyes reflecting the faint glimmer of stars hidden beyond the cloud cover. Helga lifted the wooden carving once more, whispering a prayer to Freya, the goddess who held the power of life and death, love and war. "Guide us through the endless night," she murmured softly. "Let the flame of hope burn bright in even the darkest hours." The silence that followed was thick, but not empty. It carried the weight of unspoken promises and the fragile determination of a people who had endured too much to surrender now. In that quiet moment, Helga understood that the endless night was not simply a season of cold and shadow. It was a reckoning of the heart. It demanded courage to face not only the harshness of the world, but the fears within themselves. It called for the strength to forgive, to rebuild, and to remember. The legacy of her daughter, the suffering of a village, and the survival of a child had woven together a tapestry that neither time nor frost could unravel. The past was a shadow, yes, but the future held the light of dawn. Helga rose, the snow crunching beneath her boots as she walked back toward the small circle of life burning within the cabin. The voices of those who had come to stand beside her rose softly, a chorus of hope, resilience, and unyielding spirit. The fire did not promise warmth forever. The gods might remain silent, and the world could still be cruel. But as long as there were those who dared to keep the flame alive, the endless night would not claim them. Helga's voice, though weathered by years and sorrow, carried a quiet power as she spoke to those gathered. "We are the keepers of the old truths, not as relics of a forgotten time, but as the roots of a new world. The night will end, and when it does, we must be ready to greet the dawn with open hearts." Thyra's small hand found hers, fingers curling tightly as if to hold the fragile promise between them. The girl's eyes shimmered with the courage of one who had seen darkness, yet chose to walk toward the light. Outside, the wind softened, the stars glimmered faintly through thinning clouds, and the first whisper of spring stirred beneath the snow. Helga looked to the horizon with steady eyes. The endless winter had tested them all, but it had not defeated them. From the ashes of loss and betrayal, a new chapter was beginning. The story of Ravenholm was far from over. And as the fire crackled on, casting its warm glow against the cold night, Helga Ravnsdottir carried forward a truth written not in runes or prophecy alone, but in the unbreakable bonds of love, forgiveness, and the unwavering will to survive. In the end, it was not the strength of blade or shield that mattered most, but the courage to listen to the voices others would silence, to protect those others would abandon, and to hold fast to hope when all seemed lost. The endless night had come and gone, but within its shadow, the light endured. If these stories of courage and sorrow move you, if the flickers of ancient wisdom still speak to the depths of your soul, consider joining this journey. Subscribe, share your thoughts, and care.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started and we really need your support. And may the gods grant you a legendary life.